Hey there, this is Michelle and welcome back to the Canadian History, a Chronology channel. Today's episode, number 31, is about Canada's war with the United States. This will be part one of this series, as there's lots to discuss as the Americans try to muscle in on us. Now, before we start, let's take a quick moment to review what we saw and heard in the last episode. We saw that the Spanish began trading with the Haida natives by 1774 and that the British James Cook came in 1778. By 1788, Spanish, British, and American ships were all in Friendly Cove. That in attempts to settle ownership and trade in the Nootka region, there were multiple conventions between Great Britain and Spain. The final one in 1794 declared Nootka as an open port to be shared by all. And finally, Spain had overextended themselves in the Pacific and had to withdraw entirely from the Pacific Northwest. Okay, with that out of the way, let's take a look at the lead-up to the War of 1812. But let's start with these thoughts first. 1. The War of 1812 was Canada's War of Independence. 2. The problems here in North America were troubling for Great Britain at this time, as the British were already engaged in a war with France in Europe. 3. To the Americans, the War of 1812 was a war of conquest, but to the Canadians, it was a war of survival. And 4. Between 1812 and 1814, Canada won the right to not be American. I guess an interesting quote to share at this time is from historian J. Bartlett Bredner when he said, quote, "Perhaps the most striking thing about Canada is that it is not a part of the United States," end quote. Now, it all started by what was going on in France in 1789. French revolutionaries overthrew the monarchy of Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. Later, a ruthless general named Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power and launched a European war of conquest. Taking a look at these events from a Canadian perspective, we see 1. The French Revolution of 1789 led to the Napoleonic Wars of 1793 to 1815, and 2. That the War of 1812 was the North American phase of this same conflict. Now, as an aside, we have the Louisiana Purchase. In 1801, Spain had returned the vast Louisiana territory to France. Then 2 years later, in 1803, Napoleon sold it to the Americans to raise funds for his conquest of Europe. As a result, the Americans control the lands from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, and the U.S. had doubled in size as it stretched its western borders to the Rocky Mountains. In Lower Canada, formerly Quebec, the government was divided along cultural and linguistic lines. Both the governor and his ruling council were English. The French-Canadian elite, like the lawyers and doctors and the wealthy farmers that made up the elected assembly, were often overruled. These French elite formed a political party called the Parti Canadien, the Canadian Party, and later, in 1806, the party launched a newsletter called Le Canadien to combat the unequal representation in the government. They wanted that the governor be required to choose his council from among the members of the elected assembly. They wanted the same parliamentary rights that the citizens of Britain had. Well, Governor James Craig responded poorly. He branded members of the Parti Canadien as desperados and dissolved the assembly. Then, during the elections of 1810, Craig seized the presses of Le Canadien and had the editor and distributors imprisoned. It didn't work for Craig. The Parti Canadien was re-elected stronger than ever, so Craig asked Britain to recall him. Craig was replaced in 1811 by the bilingual and conciliatory George Prevost. He cancelled Craig's campaign of terror and appointed French Canadians to the courts and to the militia. Prevost calmed the tensions, and it was a good thing at the time. He played a key role in ensuring French-Canadian loyalty in the war with the United States that followed. The reach of both Canada and the United States would cross the continent and reach the Pacific coast. Both sides wanted to stake claim to the mouth of the Columbia River, a major trade route into the western interior. Alexander Mackenzie was a Scotsman and a Canadian and worked for the Northwest Company. He would be the first person to cross North America over Mexico, and he left some graffiti, the most famous graffiti in Canadian history. After having traversed the Rocky Mountains and making it to the Pacific coast, but not the Columbia River, he inscribed the following on a boulder there. Quote, Alex Mackenzie, from Canada, by land, 22nd July, 1793, end quote. When the American president, Thomas Jefferson, read about Mackenzie's overland trek to the Pacific, he knew he had to act fast. Jefferson dispatched Lewis and Clark, two explorers, to travel to the mouth of the Columbia River to raise the U.S. flag. To counter this move, the Northwest Company sent its own expedition under Simon Fraser. Unfortunately, he did not discover the headwaters of the Columbia River. Then there was David Thompson, a Welshman and a Canadian, who finally made it to the headwaters of the Columbia River in the mountains in 1811. He followed the river all the way to the ocean, but was too late. The Americans had already arrived and planted their flag and had already built a fort. At this time, Britain was battling Napoleon in Europe, and the Americans saw this as their chance to capture Canada. The battle cry of the Americans was, quote, free trade and sailors' rights, end quote. Why? Well, for one, Britain had placed France under a naval blockade, preventing it from trading with neutral nations. And the United States was one of these neutral nations and was hurt financially in its need to import and export goods. Adding to this tension, the British had captured nearly 400 American vessels. And on top of this trade tension, the British Navy asserted its right to board foreign ships and press any British citizens they found, such as sailors, traders, and traitors, into military service. Because of all of this, the Americans decided to attack Canada, a British colony. Unfortunately for the Americans, they thought it would be as simply as marching into Canada. Great Britain itself was tied up with their war in Europe, and Canada was poorly defended and exposed. And the Americans had the numbers on their side. The population of the United States at this time was 7.5 million, compared to the less than 80,000 in Upper Canada. And even if all of Canada was included in the account, the Canadian population would be less than 500,000. The American president, Madison, believed that the conquest of Canada would be a mere matter of marching. Henry Clay, Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, boasted that the Kentucky militia alone would be enough. So it was, on June 18, 1812, the United States of America declared war on Great Britain and began to make immediate plans for the conquest of Canada. Well, that's it for this episode. Let's summarize. In this episode, we saw that the War of 1812 started as Napoleon waged his war of conquest on Europe, and that the War of 1812 was a North American phase of this conflict. Napoleon sold the Louisiana Territory to the Americans to raise funds for his conquest of Europe. The French elite in Lower Canada formed the Parti Canadien, and later, in 1806, the party launched a newspaper called Le Canadien. Fed up, Governor James Craig dissolved the Assembly. Craig was replaced in 1811 by George Prevost. He cancelled Craig's campaign of terror and appointed French Canadians to the courts and to the militia. And then there was the race to the Pacific coast from the interior. And then on June 18, 1812, the United States of America declared war on Great Britain and began to make immediate plans for the conquest of Canada. Okay, with the summary out of the way, please stay tuned for the next episode, episode 32, where we jump into the War of 1812, Part 2. Here, we'll look into the war in Upper Canada. Now remember, at any time, feel free to leave comments or questions below, and I'll do my best to respond to them all. And please, be a true Canadian and be polite. And if you like this content, subscribe to my channel and give it a thumbs up. And hit the bell if you'd like to be notified of any new content. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.